The need for media with integrity is more important than ever. As a licensed member of the media, we have a responsibility and a duty to engage in discussion on topics that are representative of our local, provincial, and national audiences' concerns and interests. We are committed to excellence in our designated format, news, opinion, and commentary. We believe in the lawful, peaceful, diligent, democratic levers of civic engagement, one important tenet of which is freedom of the press, to be facilitators and not censors of debate. This issue of grave error is certainly a challenging one for many of us to wrap our heads around, and certainly at Leaders we try to, as best we can, take a healthy skepticism to claims that are made about all kinds of topics, including this one.
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
So with me to help understand this claim is certainly one of the researchers that has studied this issue very closely for years. Her name is Professor Frances Widdowson, and I want to welcome Frances to our program. Welcome, Frances.
Thank you for having me on.
So, Frances, these are significant claims about the issue of mass graves, and certainly the one in Kamloops has caught our nation's attention. I think some half of Canadians would be shocked to learn that there actually doesn't appear to be any evidence. So is there any evidence to suggest that there are actually mass graves in Kamloops?
I should mention that probably the better words for it are clandestine graves or clandestine burials, because that's the issue. And there is no evidence of clandestine burials at Kamloops or any other place in Canada at this time.
Okay, so you're suggesting that there is no evidence of any secret or clandestine mass graves in Kamloops, period.
Yes, and the reason why I say clandestine burials is because there are graves in cemeteries, abandoned cemeteries, where the markers have blown away, but that's a completely different matter than the issue of clandestine burials, which suggests that there was some kind of nefarious activity that occurred that resulted in people being buried secretly.
Okay, because I think for many Canadians, they were just horrified by this announcement that there was some type of technology used, ground penetrating radar, that clearly identified the number of graves, that there were children involved. And yet, by the admission of people who use this radar, that's not evidence, because that just shows differences in soil density and tree roots and all the rest. So is that right?
That's correct. And Sarah Beaulier, who was the person who did the ground penetrating radar work for the Kamloops case, it was announced by the band on May 27th that the remains of 215 children had been found. And then on July 15th, 2021, Sarah Beaulier, when she was giving her presentation, said that in fact there were just 200, not even 215, but 200 targets of interest or anomalies. And the reason why it got downgraded from 215 to 200 targets of interest was because she had discovered after the fact that the archaeology department at Simon Fraser University had done excavations in that area where there were 15 targets of interest. And so far, we have not had Dr. Beaulier's report released. This is a very important thing that needs to be released to the public, because it was funded by $40,000 of public money from the Department of Canadian Heritage. So we need that report, definitely.
Okay, so in light of these claims, it's clear from your point of view that there's no evidence. There has been some investigation, but those reports haven't been released. What about Simon Fraser's past archaeological work on that site for years. Is that public information? That's a publicly supported university. Is that public information?
That's another very, very surprising occurrence, is that Simon Fraser University, the archaeology department at Simon Fraser University, was told by the lawyer for the Kamloops band that they should not discuss the Kamloops case publicly. And that is a publicly funded institution. So it is very surprising that an academic institution that is publicly funded would have its discussion of this case clamped down upon by a political entity, which is the Kamloops band.
Okay. So there's a lot of really important questions that need to be asked. I guess as a layperson, I would ask, when there's a kind of a crime scene, when there's a significant issue like this, the claims of a a secret mass grave, wouldn't you just call the police and they would bring in forensic personnel and they would examine the site? Has that happened?
This is another interesting part of the story, is that the RCMP did start an investigation, but what occurred was that Murray Sinclair went and intervened and told Sarah Bollier, who is the GPR expert, that she should get a lawyer to protect her interests when the RCMP started to question her, which you would expect the RCMP to do, because she was the person who did the ground penetrating radar, and that was where you would start as the RCMP. And as a result of Murray Sinclair's intervention, the RCMP backed off and turned everything over to the Kamloops band, which to this date has not started any excavations at Kamloops. And if they are serious in maintaining it is a crime scene, which there were claims made in 2021 that was the case, they should have that site excavated, or at least start some of the excavations in particular areas.
Okay, so to be clear, the RCMP have really not done their job to investigate this, and it appears that there may have been interventions. We don't know that 100%, or is that known 100%?
It is known, yes. Murray Sinclair made this statement in I think it was a Senate committee on, and there's a clip. There's a YouTube clip that is actually been uploaded onto the wokeacademy.info site. So we have that information.
All right. Well, it just seems hard to believe that a civilized nation like Canada would be in a situation where these really quite major claims are made regarding mass graves, and as a civilized nation, that we would not look at the facts. I know that this has certainly come up on the international stage where, in many different circles, people are wondering what is going on with Canada. So I need your help to kind of understand and break down what's going on. And certainly one of the important actors has been really elected officials that have shown up on the scene of Kamloops, and really asserting that there are these mass graves, and yet in fact there hasn't been that kind of investigation. Is that part of the problem as well?
That is definitely part of the problem, and politicians are acting in a very irresponsible fashion, because although we can understand why they might have originally, because they heard this from the Kamloops band, just adopt that kind of false information, we now have had 3 years where it is widely understood and known that this was false information put forward by the Kamloops band. So this should all be retracted now. This should all be publicly retracted, and there should be some recognition of the types of misinformation that was distributed to the Canadian public.
Yeah. Well, it begs a lot of serious questions. What is going on here? And I think one of the questions I have is certainly, where has the media been? I think there's been a lot of debate among some media asking those questions, but a lot of mainstream media doesn't seem to be asking the hard questions. So what's interesting here is I want to share a clip of an interview you did recently with a representative from the CBC, no less, about this issue. And I want to share part of the clip. The entire one is actually available through your blog, Francis Widdowson. if you're interested in listening to the whole thing. So let's listen to that clip now.
I'm wondering why it's so important to you to discredit this.
I believe in the truth. I think the truth is important. Do you think the truth is important?
I'm going to ask, do you...
You should read Grave Error. I think you really need to read that book because you do not have an understanding at all.
Ma'am, I don't need that from you. Thank you.
Well, that was a really quite an interview or discussion that you recorded, and I encourage people to listen to the entire clip on your blog. But it is fascinating where you're basically kind of head to head, basically saying, do you not care about the truth? And so it's like, I read the interview as that you were not so much trying to discredit the story per se, but trying to stand up for the truth. And that's certainly the mark, I think, of really should be the mark of any civilization, let any individual, where we do have healthy, constructive discussion based on facts and evidence. So were you surprised by that discussion that you had with that CBC reporter?
I was amazed. I was absolutely amazed. I've never had an interview like that before. And it just shows you how people have accepted what is, in fact, false information. And it doesn't seem to matter how much you hit people between the eyes with the facts of the matter. They just continue to make statements such as the remains of 215 children, the unmarked graves that were discovered, all these sorts of things, when it is highly improbable that there will be clandestine burials at Kamloops, because not one parent has said that their child never came home from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And if that's the case, who are the bodies of, who make up these bodies of 200 bodies of children? There just is not, it doesn't make any sense for people to be making this claim.
Mm-hmm. No, it is really a head scratcher. So, we really got to ask, what's going on here? It's almost, it seems almost like there's a kind of a psychological buying into a story that in retrospect doesn't seem to be based on real evidence. So, that's why healthy skepticism is so important. We need to base our discussions, and indeed, the whole process of reconciliation is supposed to be based on truth-telling, not, dare I say, fabrication.
Well, interestingly, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and this is something I went over in an article that I did called Relative Truths and Rent Seeking, the idea of truth that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has is not what most people until 5 minutes ago thought of as being the truth, which is something that is objectively determined. Their idea is that the stories that Indigenous people put forward are true to them, so they're subjectively true, which of course is not what we mean by the concept truth, which is something that can be objectively verified by all people and agreed upon by everyone.
All right. So this is very confusing, I think, to most people, is that, are you saying that out of the university circles and so many academic discussions about truth, there's a kind of a particular school of thought that's developed that says there is no real truth. It's kind of in this realm of what's called postmodernism, and without trying to make this too complicated. So there's some people out there that believe that the truth is kind of what you assert it to be from your own lived experience. And so are you saying that there's some circles of people that would actually say, we don't need to do any investigations. We don't need to show any evidence because we think that this happened and that's our truth. So therefore, leave us alone and accept that. So this is like almost like you've got a whole circle of people on a kind of a different planet when it comes to facts and evidence and truth telling. This is absurd. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And the postmodern move that you're talking about, which happened in the 1960s, whereby subjective beliefs took the place of objectively verifiable arguments, has now had another twist, which is that to aid the people who are perceived to be oppressed, and Indigenous people are perceived to be one of those groups, you should pretend to believe that you accept what they're putting forward. So that's the way you're going to empower people who are perceived to be oppressed to overcome their oppression, is by agreeing that what they put forward as true, which is their subjective beliefs, are actually true. And this is the difficulty that we're facing now with the Indigenous policy area, is that if you try to challenge these beliefs, which is what I was doing in that interview with Jordan Tucker, who was the CBC journalist, is that you end up being accused of a person who is not supportive of Indigenous aspirations. But Indigenous people need the truth, just like everyone else does, and it's going to have serious detrimental consequences if they do not have a realistic assessment of what's happening in Canadian society.
Okay, wow. So this is like a big gap between the worlds of what we even think is truth and evidence. I mean, this is, I think, a sub-story here that really a lot of people really don't have a clue about. And I think that's where people like myself find this very confusing. And I'm wondering if there's another side to this that's very practical, and that is the whole notion that if you make these kinds of claims, does that help people make other claims that are financial in nature? Is there a lot of money to be made from this? And I know that sounds very hard-hearted or insensitive, because these are very terrible claims. Like, I think every Canadian is just shocked by them. But is there a cynical side to this as well that has to do with money and power?
Yes, there is, unfortunately, and this does not help the marginalized Indigenous people in the isolated communities. There are a number of lawyers and what's called neo-tribal elites, which is the Indigenous leadership, that is making millions and probably billions of dollars off of these kinds of claims, because the more you can stress the harms that are caused, and of course genocide, the claim of genocide being the most significant charge, the more resources can be extracted from the government. And we've seen this. We have $7 million that went to the Kamloops band following their claims that they made. And then we had $250 million that was distributed to other Indigenous groups in Canada. And this came directly after the false claims were made by the Kamloops band on May 27th, 2021.
Well, so in your opinion, you have to really look at the kind of money that's flowing to these groups and where it's going and under what pretext. And so part of that pretext is that, look, we have been unfairly treated, and in many cases they have been. But this is going another step further, isn't it?
It is, and we have to ask the question, what is needed in order to improve the conditions in Indigenous communities? Yeah. And is distributing $250 million for archaeologists, lawyers, consultants to try to uncover these unmarked graves, these clandestine burials for which there is no evidence whatsoever, how is that going to assist these deprived people that live in these isolated and dependent communities? That should be the focus of Indigenous policy.
So in your opinion, that could be another side to the story that we need to be able to engage on and debate. And gosh, it sounds like we've got a lot of work to do in terms of whether it's audits, in terms of how the money's being used, but also how we really get at the truth of these situations. And if there's no forensic investigations by the police, I think Canadians are kind of left in this strange limbo land where there's these major accusations, and then understandably a lot of people assume that they're based on fact when they're not. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly true. And the truth is not harmful. I find this argument to be completely erroneous. Everyone needs the truth. truth is what enables justice to be pursued. And if we don't have truth, we will never be able to figure out how to develop a just society for everyone. And that is key, is that everyone is saying that somehow challenging, thinking critically about things is somehow some kind of right-wing kind of idea. This is not true at all. It is, we all need to be able to understand things, and especially people who are oppressed need to be able to understand things, because it is understanding which enables them to be able to overcome their oppression.
So, Francis Widdowson, it sounds like you are very concerned, first and foremost, about truth-telling, and that is a very important part of empowering not only our society and the rule of law, but also people, groups that have been oppressed, including our Aboriginal fellow Canadians.
Exactly. And, Indigenous people, there's no doubt there were abuses that occurred in the residential schools. There was a great deal of insensitivity. This is all part of understanding what occurred. But to have this, what was originally misinformation and now seems to be actually disinformation, because I think people are actively trying to perpetuate false claims, this is just stoking anger within Indigenous communities. And what this does is that this just allows Indigenous people to be manipulated and to accept the transfer of all these funds that, instead of going into things like education and healthcare, are going into these pointless exercises in trying to, determine whether there are these clandestine burials, which so far, after 3 years, we have not had one clandestine burial which has been discovered by any of these efforts.
Wow, that's really quite a perspective that you bring to this conversation, Francis, and you're a researcher that's been looking at this issue for years. So tell me, as Canadians, and some Canadians might be just really in shock or disbelief in terms of what you're saying, what can they do to be able to help understand or appreciate the different perspectives on this very important topic?
Well, there is the book Grave Error that was edited by Chris Champion and Tom Flanagan, and that has, I believe, almost 20 articles which are evidence-based and are not denying the abuses that happened and the terrible things that went on, but are saying that in order to make these claims about the clandestine burials or claims of genocide, these sort of more contentious claims, we need to take into consideration a variety of perspectives on these matters to try to develop a more complete picture of what happened historically. And that has not happened at all over the last 3 years, but hopefully we are seeing some movement now with the publication of this book.
So, in your opinion, are you seeing some hopes that the debate is actually opening up more and more? Because I think initially people were just in shock, and it was more of an emotional response that, wow, this is just such a major claim. Of course it's got to be true. But do you find that public discussion is now changing?
Well, I think with what happened in the city of Quesnel on April 2nd gave people a bit of a window into the kind of atmosphere that exists in critically discussing this issue. And that was shown by the wife of the mayor, Pat Morton, who just shared the book with a couple of her friends and also the school board, I believe. And then the kind of vitriolic response that she received and that her husband had to endure because he was married to her, that is just amazing that that's happening in Canada. And the way those city councillors acted, the absolute autocratic fashion that they responded to this attempt to discuss things critically is amazing that this is happening within Canada.
So this is such a highly charged topic for some Canadians, and they do so, I'm sure, out of good intentions to try to promote and find justice for people that have been oppressed. It's almost like one side is saying, how dare you even talk about this issue? And without even reading the book. Is that what's going on?
Yeah, it's an argument that the Indigenous, what's called knowledge keepers, have spoken. How dare you not accept what they put forward as being true? But people's testimonies and based on memories of things that happened, 50 years ago, or not even things that happened to them that are secondhand information, largely drawn from the conspiracy theories of a defrocked United Church minister whose name is Kevin Annett, who made wild claims that are obviously untrue. This is unbelievable that people are expecting these sorts of accounts to just be believed without any corroborating evidence. And this is what we need now. We have had these false claims made 3 years ago. The record needs to be corrected. And the only way this can happen is if excavations are done in the Kamloops case.
Okay, so that's to sum it up, is that we need to have a healthy skepticism. We need to stand up for the truth. And in that context, we need to have debate. And we need to let the RCMP or police authorities do their job to get to evidence, to get to the bottom of this issue. So thank you for joining us, Frances.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.